So we are looking at modern agriculture and pesticides, and so we'll just jump right into it. So when we talk about modern agriculture, we're really talking about it after the occurrence of the Green Revolution. And so in the Green Revolution, we increased the yields of crops by a lot. So if you look at this graph right here, right, the amount of area that we are harvesting actually stays the same, but the amount that we're getting, so the yields and the production is increasing quite a bit. And so the reason for that is because the Green Revolution actually depends on synthetic fertilizers, chemical pesticides, pretty intense irrigation, and lots of heavy equipment. And so, with the invention and the starting to use these kinds of methods, the yield that we were able to produce from the crops from the area we had increased quite a bit. And so, as we look at the use of pesticides, which is where we're going right now, it's important to know kind of the vocab behind it. And so we say that a pest is any organism that's going to damage our crops or really anything that we don't want. So a pest it can also be a weed. And so a weed is any plant that competes with the crop that you want. Um, and pesticides are any poisons that target the pest organism. So whether it be an insect or a plant or a fungus, um, we would use a pesticide. So it's kind of an umbrella term. Whereas insecticides are targeting insects, herbicides targeting plants, fungicides targeting fungus. You get the picture. And so in the U.S., we're looking at about 9 million pounds of pesticides being used every year, and 75% of this is applied to agricultural lands. The other is residential use, and also in more commercial use to make things pretty, like in golf courses and whatnot. But the usage is definitely increasing in developing countries as well. So now that we are trying to curb our use, the developing countries are definitely increasing their usage. And so a pesticide, depending on what we're looking at and when we're looking at, we used to have first generation pesticides, and these were mostly inorganic compounds, so we're looking at heavy metals mostly, lead and mercury, which is actually a reason why you don't really want to eat rice from the southeast, because they used to put a lot of lead down as a pesticide. And so the rice that's grown in the southeast of the U.S. is actually pretty heavy in lead. And so when you look for rice in the grocery store, Asian rice is good, and then as a second best is rice from California. So just a little FYI. Also used are botanicals, so anything that's derived from plants themselves, and that includes nicotine is used as pesticide. Second generation pesticide are the pesticides that we tend to use now. Obviously, we don't use DDT now, as we'll talk about in the future, but the synthetic compounds that are made in a lab that we can then spray on our crops to reduce pests. And so these pesticides can be either a broad spectrum pesticide, which are more general, and so it kills pretty much everything, as opposed to a narrow spectrum pesticide, which really only kills the target species. So it's very selective on what it would kill. So they both have their pluses and minuses behind them. And so major groups of insecticides, there are the chlorinated hydrocarbons. This is any organic compound, so hydrocarbon, right? Hydrogen and carbon together. They're organic. These are containing chlorine. We also call them persistent organic pollutants because they are very slow to degrade and they persist. So they are persistent organic pollutants, or POPs, P-O-P. And these are largely restricted now. Organophosphates are used a lot. These are pretty poisonous. They contain, as you could guess, phosphorus, and they aren't as persistent in the environment. They tend to break down a lot faster. Um, and then the carbamates, which are derived from carbamic acid. And so pesticides have its place for sure in disease control, fleas, lice, mosquitoes, really any kind of vector or anything that carries disease. We want to get rid of those because we don't want, disease as human beings. Um, well, really, as living life, we don't want disease, right? But anyway, a really good example is malaria. And so malaria is mosquito borne. It's a mosquito borne illness. And 2.7 million people die from it every year. So we don't hear about it a lot here in the US. But, in the areas that are pretty highly populated with mosquitoes, you do have this malaria. Also mosquito-borne yellow fever, or now really, this up-and-coming disease is Zika. There's a huge development in Zika, and so hopefully that certain areas are more prone to it than others because of the breed of mosquito that's there. And so DDT was used for killing mosquitoes originally, and as I said, I keep bringing up DDT, but we'll talk about it more later. Obviously, you are protecting your crops, so you don't want your pests to eat your crops, and it's going to save you money in the long run. So if I invest a little bit of money in pesticides, I'm going to save money because my pests aren't eating my crops. Whereas some detriments, or some deleterious effects, or non-beneficial effects of pesticides, is that pests can become resistant to pesticides. And so just like any organism, natural selection comes into play. So they're evolving to be resistant. And while your pesticide might kill a lot of your pests, so like 99% of your target organism, a few are going to survive. So that 1% survive. And so the 1% that survive are the ones that are alive to go on and make little insect babies. And those babies are then resistant to the pesticide. And so the pesticides ends up stop being effective because the population changes. And we call this an evolutionary arms race because chemists are trying to increase the toxicity, and the pests will die off. The ones that are resistant will survive. They will make a population that's resistant to the chemical, and thus goes the cycle. And so this cycle is actually called a pesticide treadmill. And so pretty much you're always trying to keep up. And so the cost of applying pesticide increases because you need to apply them more frequently in larger doses, plus the cost of developing new pesticides is quite large. And then obviously your effectiveness decreases because your genetic resistance in the pest is increasing. And so you can put into place some resistant management. And so you want to maximize a period in which a pesticide is actually useful. And so, you can do that a lot with timing of that, and with integrated pest management, which we will talk about in a little bit. So pesticides also cause some imbalances to the ecosystem. You're spraying to kill insects, but these pesticides can also affect other organisms in that ecosystem. And so even though we have increased our use in pesticides, the amount of crops that we have lost hasn't actually really changed. So you look at how many crops we lose, from insects, it stayed at a pretty steady rate of 13%. So even though we're using more, our crop loss is kind of evened out. So we have to keep